In this essay, I'm claiming that the proper attitude to guide your thinking is humility, by which I mean humility manifested in intellectual honesty. I'll give you several illustrations to suggest that intellectual honesty is a kind of humility resulting from three realizations. First, you, like every other human being, are prone to subjectivity and bias. Second, reality, or the world of all facts, is objective and is only incompletely and imperfectly known by you or anyone else. And third, ideas merely approximate reality, like a low-resolution picture. Acknowledging these three truths is a giant step toward intellectual honesty. Or, putting it another way, I'm saying that good thinking faces three pitfalls: your tendency toward selective attention, the hugely complicated nature of reality, and the attractiveness of false ideologies. Even the smartest and most accomplished people are subject to these inevitable principles. So for my first illustration, let's imagine a discussion on stage between two very learned, well-respected authorities on a certain subject. Virtually any subject and any experts will do. Both of these experts have written numerous books and papers in their field. In their discussion, these brilliant scholars attempt to show how their ideologies match up with the world of facts. They agree on some things, and they disagree on other things. So to begin with, we see they both believe an objective reality or a world of facts exists. And, being scholars, they both claim to have developed a high-resolution picture of the real world. On the points in which they disagree, there are only two kinds of objections they can raise. One is the objection alleging bias or selective attention, as if to say, you're ignoring evidence that doesn't support your claims, or your evidence is cherry-picked. The other is an objection alleging ignorance or wanton disregard for reality, as if to say, what you're saying just doesn't comport with the facts. Or, less charitably, you don't know what you're talking about and you're just making things up. In other words, there are either facts you ignore or facts you just don't know, but you claim you know. You really only have those two choices. This is also how lying works. You either deceptively present some facts while hiding other facts, or you just make things up that aren't true. So what does all of this say about thinking in general? It says, in order to paint a picture of reality with the highest possible resolution, you have to attempt three things. First, you have to avoid the pitfalls of selective attention and ulterior motives, those motives that would lead you to create a false picture. Second, you have to recognize that there will always be facts you don't know, and your ignorance always exceeds the facts you do know. And third, you have to accept that no ideology is perfect. Intellectual honesty says, to the best of my knowledge, and the best of my ability, taking into account all available facts, I make truth claims. But nevertheless, our imaginary scholars both strongly believe they're correct, and they have followers who exclusively choose one or the other of them as an authority. To judge between them, you have to ask, if there's only one reality, which one of your scholars is closer to it? Who has the higher resolution picture? And as for you, not a scholar, how close are you to it? An even shorter and simpler version of that illustration is if you go to 2 or more doctors with a problem, you may get 2 or more diagnoses. The subjective element is a doctor's understanding of the human body. The objective element is the reality that the human body is very complex. And the ideologies are the different diagnoses that each doctor believes is true. Okay, so I'll expand on the 3 principles: the subjective self, objective reality, and ideology in turn. First, subjectivity, which includes bias and selective attention. Most thinking begins with an impulse. Something bothers you, makes you curious, confuses you, worries you, excites you, threatens you, flatters you, and so on. A feeling is triggered, and your mind searches for connections to make sense of what the feeling might mean, what to attribute it to, what the implications are, etc., etc. The emotional impulses are automatic, but rational responses to impulses are not automatic. They have to be learned, cultivated, and exercised. And that is where your verbal powers, your memory capacity, and your powers of logic come into play. How well you can articulate the feeling or your response to it depends on your verbal power, which depends on the richness of your language background, how much you've read, your command of vocabulary, and your knowledge and experience in general. And on top of all this, you've been endowed with only a certain amount of brain power. Some people have more, some people have less. Most of the time, most likely, your impulses to think will push you along a mental path of least resistance. And it will keep to the course that leads away from mental discomfort. That is, mostly, the discomfort of being wrong, which I will get to shortly. Anyway, if you're not challenged or questioned, your train of thought will stick to familiar tracks. Your bias is the big, strong engine that leads the way. Let's say, for the sake of illustration, someone mentions the Congressional Affordable Care Act in conversation, and an initial feeling is triggered. I'll use this example because it's a complex thing every American can be expected to have an opinion about, insofar as it affects us and our medical insurance. It's political, which brings us into argument territory, but it's not so controversial as abortion, transgenderism, Palestine, or gun control, or a whole host of other hot-button topics. In any case, the way we think when we're confronted with any of these topics follows pretty much the pattern I will describe. Let's say, too, that you're not an expert on the Affordable Care Act or the healthcare system in general, and you haven't read the text of the bill, or indeed haven't read much about the text of the bill. So having the Affordable Care Act brought up in conversation, you may have one of several impulsive reactions, depending on your attitudes and experience. You could feel a quick pang of boredom because it's about politics, which you hate. You could feel positively about it because it's associated with the Obama administration, which you love and you'd like to defend. Or you could feel disgusted because it's associated with the Obama administration, which you hate and you would like to criticize. Or you might feel embarrassed because you don't know anything about it and you don't want to admit it. The Affordable Care Act, being a major piece of legislation, hundreds of pages long, surely has a variety of good and bad in it, which you can say about most things. But you can still characterize it as either mostly good or mostly bad, or grade it on a scale. But once you take a side or pick a grade, intellectual honesty requires that you give reasons and cite specifics, or admit you really don't know anything about it. Unfortunately, though, in this thought experiment, you're being confronted with this idea on the spot, in conversation. And the first stop on your train of thought might not be intellectual honesty. Instead, it will probably be a stop to check in with your tribal feelings and the opinions you have ready for quick deployment. You might even pick an opinion you think will align with the person you're talking to because you want to cultivate your relationship. You can be excused for all of this because thinking done properly can be a frustratingly painful process. The natural tendency in our activities is to conserve energy and memory space, but mental improvement, like physical improvement, requires a lot of energy and rigorous training. But the most painful thing of all is the risk of being wrong. So let's talk about being wrong, or not being able to maintain the belief that you are right. Being wrong disrupts the order of your inner world, forcing you to change your mind and disrupt all the values and connections that structure it. Being wrong threatens you and your self-image of competence. It threatens you with the realization that you're not as smart as you think you are. And being wrong threatens your standing in the relationships that you want to have good standing in. You might not be tolerated if you start thinking differently. So it's easier to ignore certain facts or just distort reality to avoid the unpleasant feeling of being wrong. As it turns out, the biggest impediment to intellectual honesty just may well be your avoidance of the threats of being wrong. And the cure is simply getting in the habit of admitting you don't know when you don't know. That sounds so easy until you try to make it a habit. So that's the subjective element. Now, let's try to illustrate the nature of reality with this Affordable Care Act analogy. Let's say you decide to take up the challenge of forming your own opinion on this so-called Affordable Care Act. You could do research, which usually means ask somebody about it, watch a video, Google it, read a few articles, check Wikipedia, or, less likely, read all 900 plus pages of the bill for yourself. It depends on how much time and effort you want to spend on it and how motivated you are to understand the myriad facets of the thing. It all depends on whether you think it's worth the effort. Being a normal human, the chances are, if you don't have to, you won't even Google it. This 900 plus page bill and our attitudes toward understanding it on a certain level provides us with an analogy for reality itself. Reality contains an endless depth of details you could learn about any given thing. The question is, what level of detail is good enough for you to know? That depends largely on your attitude and your motives. Which details are good enough for school? Which details are good enough for internet arguments? How much do you need to know to impress people? To be honest with yourself, you might do research solely for the purpose of winning an argument, cherry-picking the evidence, trying hard to stick with the conclusion you started with. And even after thorough research, there may still be room for a variety of conclusions. And you can still preserve your preconceived vision of the world by choosing something compatible from among that variety of conclusions. So, our approach to any complex thing is like our approach to reality in general. It all depends on your attitude and what motivates you, and whether you think it's worth it to you to do the work it requires to understand. But then on another level, the so-called Affordable Care Act is definitely not reality. It's just a ream of paper with a lot of words which purport to correspond to countless details concerning the health care of hundreds of thousands of people, which itself is a small subset of the buzzing, blooming, endless complexity we call reality. The words on that ream of paper constitute an ideology, which is a constellation of ideas claiming not only to describe the way things are, but the way things should be. And that brings us to the third principle, the world of words for which I use the term ideology. Relatively few of the hundreds of millions of people it concerns will read the Affordable Care Act, but many will adopt a certain characterization of it, as we will with most political issues. And the more emotion that's associated with that characterization, the more deeply entrenched your ill-informed opinion will become, no matter what the subtle contours and finer points of reality are. Politicians speak passionately to their constituents about how great or how terrible the Affordable Care Act is, creating a persuasive world of words. One politician emphasizes only the benefits of the legislation, and another politician emphasizes only the costs of the legislation. That's the politician's role, to persuade you with a world of words. And your role is to cultivate your knowledge and verbal powers to establish whether or not those words correspond to the world of facts. Being persuaded by emotional appeals and accepting a simple characterization of things is easy. Stopping and thinking and looking things up is hard and time-consuming and boring. And isn't it maddening to be insulted by people who can barely articulate one side of an argument when you've put in the hours, you've read all the relevant material, and have listened to all sides of the argument? Isn't it maddening to have your intelligence insulted by zealots who substitute slogans for actual thinking? But these zealots are not the only enemies of intellectual honesty and rigorous thinking. There's also those I will call the mushy moral equivalence types. Consider that an accurate characterization of complex phenomena lies between two moral extremes. Say, this is all good or this is all bad. But in reality and in context, an accurate characterization almost never sits precisely in the middle, positing equal parts good and bad. There may be fine arguments and evidence on both sides, but moral clarity requires a judgment, and that may be a difficult judgment to make. We often lazily dismiss arguments and evidence, saying, well, there's good and bad on both sides. Well, that may be true as far as it goes. But facts and truth reside in actual proportions, and the devil is always in the details. The task in thinking is not to dismiss a controversy with a moral equivalency, but to gather as many relevant facts as possible and make a judgment based on right proportions. There is indeed the better case and the more persuasive argument, which is a basis for judgment. But that doesn't come easy. How much of your life do you want to spend on that? It would be more intellectually honest to say you don't know than to play the there's good and bad on both sides card just for the sake of peace. If how to think means how to make your thoughts and their products correspond more closely to reality, then the ideal would be to cultivate a well-informed, well-analyzed opinion on a given subject. And finally, how then can we escape the pitfalls of ignorance, emotion, tribal thinking, and the warped ideologies that they produce? Thinking about any subject begins with knowledge. It has been said, with all you're getting, above all, get knowledge. And what is knowledge? Knowledge is the raw material you use for judgments and opinions. So with this in mind, I can do no better than to quote Confucius, who said, "Shall I teach you what knowledge is? When you know a thing, to hold that you know it. And when you do not know a thing, to allow that you do not know it. This is knowledge." This is the essence of intellectual honesty, that there should be no pretense in the profession of knowledge. Admit that you don't know when you don't know. Just be honest.